Okay.
Well, I've forgotten everything and you start all over again.
There you go.
Who said that? Who said that? Well, actually, you know, when you're in the fraternity, that's something you do. You do it over and over and over and over again until you think that there's nothing possibly that you could learn further about it. And then when you reach that stage, that's when you start having the breakthroughs. And you do it over and over and over and over again until you've got those symbols are so deeply embedded into your consciousness that they're a part of you. So after having said that, I'm going to give you the benefit of a little test to see how much you actually have remembered. Dennis, I think you can go first. To see how well you've retained the things you've been hearing for the last year. Oh, if I were to say to you, okay, you're out, I don't know if you guys ever talk about this casually or out with other acquaintances, some of the information and the stuff that we're getting into in here. But if you were to say, yeah, there really was a great flood, and you had some skeptic there and they said, well, what's the evidence? The video I was going to show you tonight, when we first started working on that, the producer was saying, well, if this thing is successful, do you have any ideas for a follow-up video? And I said, yeah, absolutely I do. I mean, because this video, actually, that I wanted to watch a little bit of tonight, it was entitled Fire from the Sky. So you can obviously see that it's dovetailing in with what we've been talking about the last two meetings. And we actually did this video 10 years ago. So it's dated now, but it still has some really good information in it. And some of the graphics and things that were in it were actually not bad for 10 years ago. They're a little primitive now. But anyways, the producer of it, Rex Hauk, said to me, well, okay, so if we did a follow-up, what would we do? I says, well, we've covered the fire thing to some extent. We do the water thing, and we talk about the fact that there was these globally catastrophic floods. And he says, well, there's no evidence for that, is there? And I said, yeah, well, yeah, there is some. There is some. So I went over some of it with him, and as I showed him some of it, he, says, I didn't really even realize this. I didn't know this. I didn't know this. I didn't know, right down the line. He just was completely unfamiliar or completely oblivious to the fact that there was this whole body of information that had accumulated. Okay, so my question to you is if you were saying to somebody, well, it seems now you've seen information that suggests that there was in fact a great flood, as the legends talk about, and somebody says, well, what's the evidence for it? What would you say?
Tell them to go talk to Randall.
I knew that was, yeah.
That's good, Ken.
Go talk to Randall.
I know this guy knows it all.
Look. No, see, I can't just be spoon feeding you guys, and you have to get some of this information down, because if I run by stuff to you the second time, see, it's all into details. It's all into details. Yeah, what if you were in conversation with somebody who had a little geological background? See, now that's, did you hear what Elizabeth just said?
No, what did she say?
Boulder bars.
That would be an
Bar in Boulder, Colorado. That's like
a boulder bar. What's a boulder bar?
That's one of those places you get a drink at.
Well, see, here's the thing. You guys have probably traveled all over, and what I'm hoping amongst all of you is that when you go on future travels, you've got, because I had somebody tell me just the other day, in fact, remember, Ken, you told me how many times you'd driven through that water gap up there, and you'd never thought about it. You never were aware of the fact of how that water gap got there. See, that's actually what I was hoping you would say. Well, if somebody asked you and challenged you on it, you'd say, well, do you know what a water gap is? And they'd say, well, and if they had a little bit of geological background, they would say, yeah, I know what it is. And you'd say, well, how did it form? Then they'd start stumbling a little bit, and they'd probably pull out, if they knew enough geology, if they'd had geology in college or whatever, they might be able to pull out the textbook explanation, which basically says that you have this river flowing across the landscape, and for whatever reason, part of the landscape starts buckling up, but it starts buckling up at exactly, and it has to, if you think it through, it has to be at exactly the same rate that the river is cutting the rock down. Right. I mean, actually, when you start thinking about it, it becomes quite ludicrous. Okay, but that is the standard textbook explanation. In fact, what you would see if you went into the run-of-the-mill geological textbooks or textbooks dealing with Earth history in any way, they bring forward the standard. Essentially, what it is a way of explaining away the evidence for catastrophe in the history of the Earth. In fact, for the whole probably first 60 to 70 years of the 20th century, that was a major goal of geology, was to explain all of that away, to explain away the evidence for there having been great catastrophes that have affected the entire planet. Well, the thing is over the years, the evidence has continued to accumulate in spite of the politically prevailing viewpoint, which is basically uniformitarianism. And what does uniformitarianism tell us? It tells us, the whole premise of it is this, is that essentially what we've seen going on in terms of environmental change in the last, say, century to 2 centuries, since scientists have actually been keeping records and watching and keeping notes and developing theories, okay, say 2 centuries. The kind of change that we've seen going on in those last 2 centuries essentially is adequate to describe virtually all change in the history of the Earth. And the assumption has always been the rates at which we see things changing out there on a day-to-day basis is adequate to explain everything in the whole history of the planet. Now, it is granted that there might be a local catastrophe, there might be an earthquake, or there might be a volcanic eruption, or there might be a forest fire. But beyond its local or regional effects, it has no global implications. That has always been the assumption. Now, if you go to ancient cultures, what do you find over and over and over again in terms of the worldview of ancient cultures? In the worldview of ancient cultures, and this, I have a hard time coming up with one single exception to this. In the worldview of ancient cultures, the catastrophic history of the Earth was a given. And in fact, all of the cultural legends, the creation accounts of these early cultures, all have similar parallel motifs, which is that there were great upheavals, usually involving fire or water. Their ancestors were the survivors of these upheavals. Usually there is a moral implication to the tale, that moral implication being that somehow someone who had a superior vantage point to his fellow human beings, usually as a result of living a much more moral life, whatever the reason is, it's usually cast within a moral framework. Certain individuals within these cultures have this superior vantage point, which allows them to take steps that then leads to their survival and their recreation of the race and their refounding of a new world order after the catastrophe has passed. Now, modern science has pretty much dismissed all of these concepts of global catastrophe, of civilizations being wiped out. Well, again, because it's this whole, I say it's the Uniformitarian Paradigm. And the Uniformitarian Paradigm basically says this: what we see out there is the end result of a whole chain or whole accumulation of incremental changes. And within that framework, one does not need to postulate a seesaw model for human civilization. One postulates instead a hyperbolic curve, an asymptotic curve that's on the upswing where we're at the peak. Now, you remember the graphs I've shown you of climate change that looks like a seesaw. Well, one of the implications of all of this knowledge is that we are justified in theorizing the existence of human culture that may have also followed that seesaw, that it rose as the climate improved. It collapsed as the climate changed dramatically or catastrophically. I presented to you the evidence showing that human beings, not different from ourselves, have been around on this planet a minimum of 150,000 years. Physiologically, anatomically, modern humans been on this planet a minimum of 150,000 years. And really, whether they went back farther than that, I suspect that our history probably goes much farther than that. However, what I'm doing is being conservative. I'm essentially invoking what hard scientific evidence says, which is essentially the finding of modern human skeletal remains. Modern human skeletal remains dating back 150,000 years. Okay, if we look at the changes in climate in the last 150,000 years, there have been at least 4 catastrophes of global proportions, which, once you begin to understand the specifics of these catastrophes and what they involve in terms of temperature change, what they involve in terms of rising and falling of sea level, what they involve in terms of the hydrology of the landscape, once you begin to really understand this, and this is one of the things I've been trying to convey to you, is a very precise picture of these events, the question really becomes not so much how did our culture suffer under these, but rather how did human beings essentially even survive? See, as I've gone through and studied and begin to understand the scope and extent of some of these changes, the last change, the one I've been focusing on, which is the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, as you know now, exterminated half the great animal species on Earth. Half of the species. And you need to just ponder that, what that means. I've said it before, I'm going to reiterate it because it's very significant. The number of species of large animals greater than 100 pounds in body weight that lived during and up to the end of the last ice age was roughly double the number of species we find today. Some of those species had endured for hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. Whatever happened 12,000 years ago, half the great animal species on the planet didn't make it across. Or if they did, they made it in such a residual fashion that the survivors were not, there was not a viable number that allowed them to actually perpetuate the race. There is evidence, for example, that woolly mammoths survived on several islands in the Pacific, and they diminished in body size to less than half of what the Ice Age woolly mammoths were. They were called pygmy mammoths, but they apparently died out. It may be that humans had a role in the dying out of the pygmy mammoths, but the general explanation is that all of the great animals, or I'll back up, at least the woolly mammoths were destroyed by human hunters. That is still the prevailing idea. I've tried to show you multiple lines of evidence showing that the demise of these animals exactly coincided with the end of the Ice Age and the rapid rise of sea level and the great flooding. That the remains of these extinct animals are found in sedimentary deposits that are completely and directly attributable to catastrophic floods. 90% of the skeletal or fossilized remains that we have of these extinct animals are found in flood deposits. Whether it's permafrost, whether it's a peat bog, whether it's gravel pits, whether it's just sedimentary sequences that are found in backwater, backflood valleys such as the Willamette Valley. The whole floor of Willamette Valley out in Oregon has 400 feet of sediment in it. And that was left there by this succession of Missoula floods. Well, quite frequently when they're excavating for a building foundation, they dig up extinct animal bones layered into those flood sediments. Well, quite clearly, those are animals that died in that flood. Now, if you look and you go the latest, Discovery Channel video, if you watch that about what caused the extinction of the animals, you'll see still number one, human hunters. Number two is some kind of undefined climate change. However, they don't actually say catastrophic climate change. They're not willing to go that far. What they do say is there was a climate change and the animals couldn't adapt, and so somehow they died out. And the third one is disease. Yet, so what they've done is they've essentially come up with 3 scenarios that allows them to avoid the fact that these animals were removed from the evolutionary stage by some type of a global cataclysm. Okay, now, my whole premise here is that, is it important for we modern humans to know about these events? Is it? I mean, is it possible that our survival, or maybe not our generation, but some generation hence, may need to know what has happened before? I mean, is this possible, or is it probable? Sam, you're itching to say something.
Okay, there's two things that I bring up. One of them is the Straits of Porpoise. How much would this play into a catastrophe type situation?
The Straits of Bosporus was a flood from 7,500 to 7,800 years ago. It was probably one of the final acts within the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene. Between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, remember, sea level came up. How much did it come up? 400 feet. Good. There's a good fact for you to know and be able to cite that when somebody starts giving you a hard time about sea level is going to raise 3 inches since the Industrial Revolution started. You can cite this 400-foot factor to them, okay? Anyways, sea level came up 400 feet. There was a plug of sediment or mud that had filled the Bosporus Straits. The sea level came up, but because the Mediterranean was not connected with the Black Sea at the time, the Black Sea was an isolated freshwater lake that had been at sea level at one point, but now it's 400 feet lower. 400 feet lower than the Mediterranean. Probably as a result of an earthquake, that sedimentary plug gave way and the water began to pour from the Mediterranean through the Bosporus Straits into the Black Sea, raising the Black Sea up 400 feet and drowning huge swaths of land around its perimeter. Clearly that would be imprinted within the memory of the people living there at that time. Now this is estimated to have happened around 7,500 to 8,000 years ago. Now you remember what I brought in last time? The new discovery of Burkle crater on the bottom of the Indian Ocean, 18 miles in diameter, Holocene in age, 600-foot thick sedimentary deposits on Madagascar resulting from that impact. Those sedimentary deposits on Madagascar have Holocene marine microfossils in them. What does that mean? Holocene means it's less than 10,000 years old. Marine means it's ocean. Microfossils, clearly it's obvious what that is. They look at these 600-foot thick sedimentary deposits, and if there's ocean life in there, that ocean life can be dated, and it's Holocene, less than 10,000 years old. That means those sedimentary sequences were laid down sometime within the last 10,000 years. Now, if an event, now this crater, Burkle crater, which is 18 miles in diameter, it's down 12,500 feet on the floor of the Indian Ocean. Now, an object that could penetrate 12,500 feet of ocean water and leave an 18-mile diameter crater on the floor is going to cause tremendous global havoc with the climate.
Tsunami.
Well, understand this. The chevrons, which is the name for these 600-foot thick sedimentary sequences that are found on Madagascar, are the result of the tsunami. The thickness of the sedimentary deposits provides us with a limit or with a minimum height for the tsunami wave. If the sedimentary deposits are 600 feet thick, that means that the tsunami wave had to be at least that much or greater. Or it wouldn't have stacked up this sedimentary sequence to 600 feet high or 600 feet thick. So it clearly implies that there was 600 plus foot tsunami waves caused by this impact. Now, an object that would be big enough to create an 18-mile diameter hole on the bottom of the Indian Ocean under 12,500 feet of seawater would probably be on the order of 1/2 to 1 mile in diameter. Now that moving at, perhaps 20,000 or 30,000 miles an hour, perhaps 25 times, 30 times the speed of a rifle bullet when it hits the ocean. What's that going to do in terms of affecting the local weather?
It's going to affect the weather all over the world.
Yes.
The wind will blow a little bit.
The wind is going to blow. It's going to inject unimaginable amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere, which is going to cause an unbelievable rainout. Now that rainout is not going to be uniform around the planet, but it's going to be selectively a lot of factors. If there's prevailing wind, I don't know if prevailing winds would have any relevance after an event like that. but I'm assuming there's going to be a non-uniform distribution of that water vapor. There's going to be certain areas that are going to be directly in the path of it that's going to receive this torrential downpour that's in effect going to wipe everything out. But you know, I've told you how under the sands of Egypt, under the Sahara Desert, if you were to take a giant broom and sweep the sand away, the whole Sahara Desert under these huge thick sand layers is channeled scabland, water carved rock. And it looks like the channeled scabland of the Columbia Basalt Plateau, except if you maybe laid a 500-foot thick layer of sand over the basalt plateau. You see, where did the sand come from, by the way? There's an awful lot of sand there. When Brad and I were out west, there's a place called the Bruneau Dunes, which is in southern Idaho, and it's at the mouth of the Bruneau River. And you can go, the Bruneau River flows out of a mountain range, I've forgotten the name of it, in northern Nevada. And it has cut a canyon. Like here's how you tell the difference between a canyon that was created by a catastrophic flood and a canyon that was created slowly. If the canyon has straight vertical walls, if it's got a sheer precipice going straight down, it's a catastrophe. If it's a slow slope like this, it's something that's created much more over a long period of time. Slow erosion will start working on the corner of a rock like this. If I was to set a cube of rock out in Sam's front yard, or a cube of chalk, say, something that eroded fast, it would do the same thing. What would happen? A square block, what would happen is the sharp edges start eroding off first and become round. And then as the thing erodes, it creates a parabolic curve, right? This is what's very interesting about the erosion, the weathering on the Sphinx ditch, is because it perfectly conforms to this parabolic curve that would form with water running over a rock. And so now the Sphinx is a very strong piece of evidence for enormous flooding in Egypt. My assumption is this flooding, the last episode of this flooding was, at the Pleistocene Holocene transition, 11,000, 12,000 years ago. Since I've learned about Burckle Crater now, I'm reconsidering that some of these events actually are more recent, historically. But clearly, if this event that created Burckle Crater is, as they're estimating, between 5,000 and 7,000 years old, well then, history, recorded history as we know it, 5,000 years ago, the first clay tablets, most of the first cities, well, what does that seem to suggest then? That history itself, again, is a function of the changes in the global climate, the global environment. And what I'm getting at, one of the whole things that I've been trying to lay out the argument for in here, is that we no longer can say, well, there was not advanced civilization in the past, because otherwise, why don't we see the record of it? Why don't we find the artifacts of it? That's the question I've heard many times. In some of the rebuttals that I've seen for the ancient Sphinx theory, the archaeologists will get on there. So if there was this advanced civilization back in the Ice Age or whenever, where's the evidence of it? Show me an artifact. Show me a building. Show me a potsherd from it. Show me something. That's what they say. Well, once you understand how catastrophic some of these events are or have been, it becomes clear why there's no evidence.
Yeah, but wait a minute, there is evidence.
Oh, well, yes, I agree with you. There is evidence. Paul said, wait a minute, there is evidence. And of course, I think agree that there's evidence.
Forbidden archaeology, did you ever?
Yeah, I mean, if you read Forbidden Archaeology, you'll find that there is a lot of anomalous evidence which essentially is ignored by mainstream. Now, to me, the Sphinx itself is a colossal piece of evidence sitting right there under everybody's noses. And if you actually read the scientific controversy and you read what the defenders of orthodoxy come with, it's ridiculous. That's the only word for it. It's absurd. You don't even have to be an educated scientist to see how ridiculous their rebuttals are. They aren't rebuttals. They're basically, what they do is they just ignore the evidence presented by the geologists like Robert Schoch and others that is in fact water erosion on the Sphinx.
Well, on the Sphinx itself, the Egyptians right now are covering the whole base of that thing with stones so that nobody will see them.
Well, yeah,
evidences of that.
isn't that ridiculous? Yeah, it's true. I mean, okay, so they've got all these campaigns going to reface the Sphinx. Well, all they're doing with that is they're covering up the ancient evidence for water erosion, which is really what the message of the Sphinx is. The message of the Sphinx is in the erosion of the Sphinx. Somebody had enough foresight to go in there, and if you read the legends about Sargon and the ancient king of Egypt who had this dream that a stream of fire was going to come pouring out of Leo, that was his dream. He thought then he should build this pyramid in order to preserve the science and wisdom of his civilization, because he had this dream that fire was going to pour out of Leo and completely wipe out this pre-Egyptian civilization that he was king of. So according to the legends, he builds this pyramid and builds it and designs it as a monument to the astronomy and mathematics and geometry and geodesy knowledge of their day. So, I mean, right there you've got it. Read, anybody read Bill Fick's the Pyramid Odyssey? One of the best books written on the subject of the meaning of the pyramid, right? Well, somebody also said, hey, if we carve, if this phenomena involves a giant flood, and we carve this structure out of limestone, and because limestone is easily eroded by acidic waters, if we carve this thing, it's going to get eroded. Somebody in the future can come along and look at this thing and figure out, put two and two together, and that's exactly what Schwaller de Lubitsch did, right? You remember who Schwaller de Lubitsch is? The Egyptologist who was actually the first person to propose, that I know of, that proposed that the Sphinx was water eroded. And then, of course, that idea lay fallow for about 30 years until John Anthony West got a hold of it. And then John Anthony West wrote a book in the 1970s where he devoted a whole chapter to the erosion of the Sphinx, clearly showing at that point that it was water eroded. And in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, he got Robert Schoch, a geologist who is an expert in water erosion of rock, over there to look at it, and he confirmed and said, yes, it's clearly water eroded. Now, have the Egyptologists factored that into their thinking about Egyptian prehistory? Not at all. In fact, see, what they've done is they've written these extremely lame refutations. KMT, the Egyptological magazine, did this, one of the refutations that supposedly was, supposedly the final word on it. But if you read it, it doesn't really even address what it does is it spends about 4 pages of red herrings. You know what a red herring is? What's a red herring?
A warning.
No, a red herring is something you bring in to distract people. If you don't have an argument, you bring in a red herring. So you distract people with the red herring so that they don't see that you don't really have an argument. See, that's what a red herring is. And this was 4 or 5 pages of red herrings. They said things like, well, in the 1980s, a block of stone fell off the Sphinx's shoulder. So if we can see erosion happening that fast, then why do we need to invoke rainfall to cause the erosion? As if somehow a block of rock falling off the Sphinx's shoulder is the same as this undulating profile formed by water erosion. For one thing, you've got roads and highways right there by the Sphinx with trucks rumbling over them, causing the ground to vibrate. The fact that a rock falls off, that'd be like saying, that chair's got a broken leg there, and that explains why Sam's roof is leaking. It makes no sense. But, if you couch it in really technical arguments, what it's going to do, it's going to fool the uneducated person. And they're going to think, oh, and there are people who basically will read something and go, okay, well, this satisfies that. Now I don't have to believe that anymore. It's like the people who read Skeptic magazine. You ever read Skeptic? You know that magazine? You've seen that? Oh, there's a couple of them out there now. Skeptic.
Enough to make you swear.
Well, it's just their whole approach is that they start out from the beginning with the assumption that none of it can be true. I mean, so it's right from the beginning, all they're doing is they're stacking it, coming up with trying to create an argument to support a presupposition that they've already made. So what I've been trying to do is say there's, out there in the New Age and so forth, the metaphysical community, a lot of people are interested in earth changes. A lot of people are interested in ancient cultures and lost civilizations and ancient knowledge. What I want to do, though, is try to get the people who are interested in that to really get their insight on a firm scientific footing. Because when you really look at the science doesn't refute it. The science supports it. The science supports the fact that there were lost civilizations. Politically correct science does not, but the real science does. Real science supports the fact that there has been a cycle of catastrophes going back for who knows how long, and that our ancestors somehow managed to survive throughout this long cycle of catastrophes that has involved at least 4 globally catastrophic events, which, if recurring today, would essentially eliminate society over the whole entire planet, would essentially put us back into the Stone Age. All you have to do, think about Katrina and what we saw from Katrina, or think about what we saw with the tsunami in Southeast Asia. Okay, what was that? 16 feet, I think. 16 feet, I think, was it? What was it? It was 16 feet. I think that was the height of it.
I didn't think it was that high. I thought it was only 7 or 8 feet.
It looked about 16 on the videos that I got.
Well, it varied depending on where you were, and it's also a function of the geometry of the coastal shelf when it's coming in. I think 10 to 16 in that range. However, if we're looking and discovering chevrons now, and again, if you remember the article that I read to you last time, they're discovering these chevrons all over the world. And only within the last few years have they figured out that these chevrons, what they are, is they're giant tsunami deposits. I told you the evidence that there was a tsunami wave that passed over Hawaii that was 11 to 1,200 feet high. It hasn't been dated yet, but the boulders that were left by that wave are up, they're there, sitting there, up on the hillsides, 1,100 feet above sea level. So with that kind of evidence and the tsunami evidence, remember the evidence I showed you of the Canaries and along the coast of Africa? There are these giant submarine canyons. That's been another geological mystery for 100 years. Since we first started getting any kind of impression, it accelerated with the last 30 or 40, realizing that most of the coastlines of the continents have off them these giant submarine canyons that shouldn't be there. Some of them are like the Grand Canyon. They're on that scale. And there's only one way to explain it. And again, it's giant tsunamis. Giant tsunamis that are hundreds of feet high, washing inland and coming back out. And not just one time, but multiple times.
Would that create the Monterey Bay?
I don't know specifically about the Monterey Bay. But there are giant submarine canyons off the coast of California. Very impressive ones.
Well, the Monterey Bay, I've flown over that, and I've done some studying on it, and it's several miles deep.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They're bigger than Grand Canyon. If you could drain the oceans of the world, you would see that there are these huge canyons, just massive, massive things that just don't. The gradualist explanations just have never worked, and that's why there's no consensus on how they got there.
So was the Grand Canyon from a catastrophic?
I would say it's the result of multiple catastrophic events, probably occurring throughout the entire Pleistocene. The last 2.5 million years, there's been probably somewhere along the line of 40 ice ages that have come and gone. The fundamentalist Christians try to say the Grand Canyon is the result of one big flood. The Uniformitarianists on the other extreme try to say that it's the result of just a long, slow, gradual downcutting. I say the actual interpretation of it is that you have multiple episodes of catastrophic flooding. See, you don't have the Grand Canyon start forming until the Colorado Plateau is uplifted. The Colorado Plateau didn't even start uplifting until 10 million years ago, because there are 10 million year old rocks. Some of the highest rocks on the Colorado Plateau are limestones. Well, limestones form in the shallow ocean. And those rocks are 10 million years old. So somewhere subsequent to those rocks being laid down in the ocean, that land was uplifted to 5 to 8 to 9,000 feet above sea level. Only when that land was uplifted was it able to start cutting the canyon. The canyon is probably the result of multiple episodes of catastrophic flooding that occurred throughout the entire Pleistocene. That is the entire period of time in which this cycle of glacial and interglacial ages has been happening. What's your question, Don?
Oh, it had to do with those submerged canyons.
Yes.
You're saying that a tsunami will have enough force under
Yes.
to carve those canyons?
Well, you know how as a tsunami is, think about what's happening when the wave pulse happens. You'll see that the ocean will recede first. As the water starts building up, it actually recedes out and exposes the ocean floor. How far out did the ocean floor expose during the Indonesian tsunami? I mean, it was miles, miles. How far of the ocean would be exposed in a 500 or 600 foot tsunami? A lot.
I see what you're saying. So
Yeah.
I didn't get that part.
So now it comes out, then it comes back in, and it washes. If you remember in the Indonesian tsunami, there was several waves. The first one came, and it wasn't the biggest one. The second one that came was much bigger than the first one, and then there was a third one that was smaller than the second one. Okay, the most catastrophic one was the second one. Okay, now this was different depending on exactly where you were, but generally speaking, there was like 3 of these waves. Now, if you've got a giant tsunami resulting, let's say, from an asteroid falling in an ocean, right? What happens then is you may have, for several days, the ocean coming up, coming back, going up, coming back. And to me, that is the most logical explanation for these submerged canyons. And I think that the next thing that they need to focus on is correlating the chevrons with the undersea canyons. I think when they do that, they'll find that there's a connection between the formation of the chevrons up on land and the giant submarine canyons down under the ocean. Right there, yeah.
The other thing would be about the impact in the Indian Ocean. Could that wash enough water up in a tsunami up the Nile, right? Backflood the Nile to create some of that water erosion around the Sphinx?
Well, since the Indian Ocean is not directly connected with the Mediterranean, what I would think is that if water was contributed, it would be rainfall. And I would be surprised, I mean, I would have a hard time imagining that there wouldn't be rainfall that was all over the Middle East.
What about when that big volcano blew, Santorini or something?
Santorini,
Santorini, yeah.
that was around 3,500 years ago.
Oh, too soon.
Well, that wiped out a lot of the Mediterranean civilization.
But I was talking about the rain that you would get from that too. You would get.
I'm not familiar with there being catastrophic rainfalls in the aftermath of that. There were certainly tsunamis created. There were tsunamis and ash falls that were catastrophic. The Minoan culture on Crete suffered dramatically from that. They may have not been completely wiped out by that event, but they suffered dramatically from it. I think it goes without saying that, I mean, one of the things I've been hammering on here in terms of the whole concept of, environmental change and global warming and so forth is that, the climate has constantly been shifting. I mean, we don't have to go back too many thousands of years ago to find grasslands down where is now the Mojave Desert and the Sonoran Desert. There have been times, there was about 1,000 years after the Ice Age, if not longer, where the southeast, where we are right now, was essentially desert. So, I mean, there's been constantly regional changes, so I don't know I haven't done any studies on the Dead Sea, what's going on there. So I can't tell you. I do know this, though. At the end of the last Ice Age, there was an enormous lake on the scale of Lake Bonneville that formed there temporarily. And a really strong analog to some of the western playa lakes that formed at the end of the last Ice Age that in some cases flooded catastrophically. Yeah.
My answer for that flooding, I brought the subject in order to show them the big years, great years.
Mm-hmm. That essentially it was caused by the Great Year. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say it was caused by the Great Year, but I see the Great Year as essentially being the clock, that sets the tempo. Not necessarily that the Great Year is causing it, but that there's something, some higher factor. Now, do you remember what I showed you 2 weeks ago about the planets marshalling the comets? You remember that?
Yeah.
What was the upshot of that? Oh, you weren't here.
Yeah, it was. They're placed just right.
Yes.
Precise orbit.
With this essentially giving us the crux of it. The mathematics of the outer continent, the outer planets, shows that when they line up, the outer planets, their combined gravitational force is just enough to dislodge comets from the inner zone of the Kuiper belt, yes, Kuiper belt, which then sends them cascading into the inner solar system where they become Earth crossers. And I think right there is where we can begin to look fruitfully for an answer to what could cause some kind of rhythmical catastrophes on Earth. Because the outer alignments of the planets are happening according to a very definite rhythm. Okay? So you have the outer planets forming these alignments, and all of the planets are on these harmonic intervals that are all related to the great year. We haven't gotten into that yet, have we? No. I don't think we have, no. Okay. All of the planets are on these harmonic orbital periods that essentially are synchronized with the great year. Okay? What I see there is that the planetary orbits and even the motion, the Earth's precessional motion, are all being governed by some, at this point, undetermined great attractor. And there are occult traditions that seem to be pointing in a certain direction as to what that great attractor might be. I.e., as Gurdjieff said, it's not the bones you must find, it's the dog you must find. What was he talking about? You guys have studied your Gurdjieff, right? No. Oh, well. Well, he said that. It's not the bones you've got to find, it's the dog. What?
Well, that would mean that you're going to find out what caused the bone to be there in the first place.
Yeah, well, the dog's a veiled reference to...
Dog star.
Of course. I was waiting for you, Jerry, to say that. Yes. Now, there is an occult tradition involving the dog star, involving Arcturus, involving Vega, and a whole collection of about a dozen stars that all seem to be organized into a coherent system. We haven't looked at this, have we? No. Okay. Oh, this is good, juicy stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I believe or suspect that that would be the direction we would look to find out what's ultimately behind this whole cycle. The great year cycle seems to be a response to this greater force that's acting on our solar system. And within certain parameters, it seems to be governing not only the precessional motion of Earth's axis, but also the orbital periods of all of the planets. So you have certain frequencies at which the superior conjunctions take place. You know what a superior conjunction is? When the planets conjunct on the same side of the sun. So you have superior conjunctions of the great outer planets, and that is going according to a certain tempo. Those conjunctions are what cause instability within the Kuiper disk, which then subsequently causes this cascading phenomena of comets falling towards the sun. As they fall in towards the sun, they become Earth crossers. Okay, what this is suggesting is that there are probably epochs where the cometary activity in the inner solar system is orders of magnitude beyond what it has been in the last several millennia, and certainly since we humans have been observing. Orders of magnitude, such that there's probably no time at all during these epochs when you could go out and not see several comets in the sky at any one time. Okay, when you read the legends, and again, see, to me, the pieces and the parts of the puzzle that modern science is missing are precisely the pieces of the puzzle that are being provided to us by the ancient knowledge. The legends about the dragons, the legends of Damocles' sword, you know, all of these things, the chariot. Remember, Phaeton was pictured as a chariot, right? Once you begin to understand this language, the symbolic language, you can go back and take a fresh look at all of these legends and realize that they're actually stories about great worldwide events that our ancestors have experienced. And were so profoundly experienced that they were impressed upon the collective memory and handed down for literally hundreds of generations. Because it's just an intrinsic part of our being, of our psychological being. Velikovsky, that was one of his great insights, was realizing that in effect, the birth of the modern world age was an extremely traumatic birth. And in effect, what he maintained was that we humans have suppressed, we have this repressed memory syndrome, if you want to call it that. And it seems to come to the forefront whenever you bring this up and you have a whole segment of humanity that goes to great lengths to not deal with these facts. To explain away the facts, to explain away the history, to explain away the myth and the tradition and the legend and so forth, no matter how universal it is. Doesn't matter if, hundreds of ancient cultures and modern cultures from around the planet have a story about a great flood. We don't consider that there's any scientific validity to those stories. Well, I say we, but basically modern conventional scholarship. What they do is they look for all kinds of explanations. One of the silliest ones, I think I've told you about this before, found a whole book on flood legends, right? Attempts to explain what was behind the flood legends. And there was a variety of things, but one scholar was convinced that the reason was that the people all over the world had legends about a flood was because when they were sleeping, if they slept too long and they had to urinate, they would have dreams about giant floods. And because people all over the world would have the same thing, laying there sleeping and needing to urinate, they would have these same dreams. So out of those dreams, they concocted the stories about big floods. I mean, I kid you not. I mean, I could actually, this is a book that's in the Emory Library. You can go in there, and that was one of the most ludicrous explanations, but some of the others were just almost as ridiculous. Nowhere in there did anybody say, though, oh, well, maybe there were real events. And of course, nowhere in there did anybody actually try to correlate it with the actual geology. Because again, geologists have tried to explain it all away. That it's just some version of modern processes. And if we bring in enough of these different elements, we can explain anything. The Carolina Bays, they said, well, it's a combination of artesian, solution, lacustrine, and aeolian processes. Well, it's almost like, yeah, well, if you bring in every conceivable thing into your explanation, you can torture it enough and make it work. But, good science always goes for the simplest explanation first. The simplest explanation, I think, is that we're looking at the aftermath of a gigantic multiple meteor strike that pretty much, left its imprints all over the southeastern United States. And that it appears to be dated roughly commensurate with the end of the last ice age.